Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, June 6th, and we've had a pretty crazy week so far. It seems to be getting crazier as it goes on. Maybe we can try to recap the week so far. So I'll try to recap it. Tell me if there's anything I missed.
Okay.
All right, so we'll start. On Sunday, Ukraine launched this daring attack, drone attack that attacked Russia's strategic bombers deep within inside Russia. At the same time, they did two attacks on trains, one in Kursk, one in Bryansk. The one in Bryansk, they collapsed a bridge actually on a passenger train. This has been deemed a terrorist attack, caused the deaths of many Russian civilians as well as injuring over 100. Um, yeah, these attacks seem to be meant to derail the negotiations in Istanbul and just simply to escalate in the hopes that NATO will get drawn into this war. It seems clear that Western intelligence had to be involved in the planning of this Operation Spiderweb, the drone attack, to some extent. And it seems like many analysts believe that really the lead intelligence agency on this was actually MI6. CIA was probably involved. They at least knew or were aware of it. Whether or not Trump was aware of this operation seems to be up for debate. There's at least plausible deniability there. But we had Trump call Putin shortly after we had our last talk, and Putin is not happy. It seemed clear just from Trump's True Social tweet that this conversation was different than previous conversations he had with Putin. Putin, he said that the conversation was good, not great like Trump always says, and that Putin is going to have to respond. So now we're in the situation right now where it seems that we are waiting for a big response from Putin. That seems to be the consensus that people think that okay, we have crossed a severe red line. Not so much that the attack had degraded Russia's military or fighting capability in really any significant way, but that this was an attack on Russia's nuclear triad. This is part a red line, a clear violation of Russia's nuclear doctrine that Putin himself has stated. So because of this, this has made it much more significant, and we're expecting something bigger. And it seems to be an acknowledgement within the U.S. as well. We had Kellogg come on and being a little scared, saying that this has gone too far. It seems to be that's where we're at right now. And then now we have a new wrench being thrown in. Now Elon Musk is saying Trump is compromised and part of the Epstein files, and just the whole thing seems to be exploding in many different ways. So, is there anything I missed? And
Well, I guess I would say the most important thing is that Russia launched a major missile and drone attack on Ukraine last night. I don't think it was their biggest, but it was quite a large one. And then afterwards, the Ministry of Defense said this was retaliation for recent terrorist attacks. And if I don't know that that actually is supposed to encompass the attacks on the strategic bomber fleet. Maybe he's just referring to the train incidents, which
right.
actually got a great deal of press within Russia and caused a great deal of anger. Um, yeah, in that phone conversation that you referred to, right? Putin said that he would have to retaliate, according to Trump. Now I hear that. Well, Trump, he's not the most reliable source, but then later Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, came out and said that yes, indeed, this is something that Putin said, and that he would do it at in a manner and on a date of his choosing, or of the Kremlin's choosing. So that suggests to me, because I mean, really, to truly retaliate for something, it takes a while to plan these attacks. It's not, like that. To be honest, the attack that occurred last night, that was a major attack. It was probably planned a couple of weeks ago at least. And it's something that we've seen it before. Sometimes they just take the Kremlin takes an attack that they were going to do anyway, and then they just frame it as a retaliatory strike. Um, I, I would be surprised. I'm not, maybe not too surprised if like this most recent attack really did include the attack on the strategic bomber fleet, because if it did, it was really a non-response. And everybody, it seems, is expecting them. All kinds of analysts and Russians and actually people who are friendly to Russia are saying, oh, they just have to do it this time, and Putin's really mad. But we know Putin. He usually I don't think it's a given that there will be a major retaliation, but there may be. There very well may be. We'll see. Again, maybe the retaliation will take the form of a major offensive, but again, that would be something that's planned. Or it's just that the knowledge, like I was saying last time, once this offensive happens, it's going to just overshadow everything else anyway.
Has Russia made the distinction between the attack on the air bases and these attacks in Bryansk and Kursk? We know the Bryansk one, Kursk, we say, okay, these were terrorist attacks targeting civilian infrastructure, harming civilians. Are they distinguishing between the aircraft that were destroyed, saying that this was something different? This was
well, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's not always. They have described the attacks on the air bases as terroristic attacks, and I think that's actually an incorrect description, to be honest. Now, clearly, the attack on the train, especially the one where the bridge was brought down on top of the passenger train, that clearly fits the definition of a terrorist attack. There's no question about it. So it's not always clear, actually, if they're talking about one or the other or both. Maybe even there was another incident that you didn't mention. That was the attack on the Kerch Bridge. It was a major attack, but it seems to have been a complete failure. They didn't do any damage. Traffic was stopped for a while. And then once the Russians were sure that the attack was over, traffic resumed. There was no need for any repair or anything. But again, that would be, that again would be just another terrorist attack. Because the Kerch Bridge is largely used by civilians. I mean, that's what it is. It's not a logistical supply line of any importance at all. And in past attacks have killed civilians crossing the bridge. And this, potentially very, probably would kill civilians. And of course, the Ukrainians understand that. They know that, the Russian military does not depend on this bridge for supply. The Russians have constructed new rail lines, across the land bridge, and they have no need of the Kerch Bridge anymore. It's mainly just a way of the civilians, residents in Crimea and visitors to Crimea use the bridge because it's convenient and they can save some time.
Do we feel like there's this is an inflection point in the war? Where Russia is sort of changing its policy and stance towards Ukraine. Before, this was an SMO, and now they're talking about Kiev is now a terrorist regime that is being backed by the West. And then they're saying this openly now. Does that change the whole...
Yeah, potentially. It does. Again, this comes from Putin himself, and Putin uses his words very carefully. He's not like Trump. He's the anti-Trump of anything, right? He doesn't just mouth off. He doesn't just say what comes to mind. He's very, very deliberate. And when he changes his vocabulary, it really means something. And in a recent, I guess it was in a recent statement that he gave, he described the Ukrainian government as a terrorist organization, or something. It had become a terrorist organization. And then he said, what's the point in negotiating with terrorists? So he hasn't officially called off the negotiations yet, or at least the contacts. As they say, okay, we're going to remain contacts. We're going to continue to have these contacts with the Ukrainians. But it certainly sounded like they were giving up on negotiations. And again, it hasn't been made official, but when Putin says something like that, you might as well regard it as official. They are now a terrorist organization, and that should change. You would expect the tactics that the Russians use going forward.
Right. There's talk about Russia officially declaring what they're doing in Ukraine as a war. Because so far, it's been referred to as the SMO, a special military operation. I believe it was Pepe Escobar saying that no, it's not declaring it as war. What you're going to be looking at is the CTO. This is now a counterterrorism operation. If they officially label it as a counterterrorism operation, how does that change the way that they are conducting this war? One thing I think it does, it changes the position in the narrative. Once Russia's adopting the position that this is a terrorist organization, that if that's accepted by the majority of the world, I think this would have huge repercussions just on Western soft power and NATO soft power, because it's saying, okay, well, then de facto the West is supporting a terrorist organization.
Right. Yeah. Again, I think it's not going to have any impact within the West. It's going to be ignored. It's going to be laughed off. It's just Russian propaganda. But yeah, I think you're right. It may affect perceptions of the conflict by the global majority. There hasn't been any official declaration, but again, I guess in the same media event where Putin referred to the Ukrainian government as a terrorist organization, he also used the word war for the first time. He didn't officially declare it as a war. I think actually in Russia, if you declare it a war, then you're talking about a full mobilization, and it would require that the entire economy be put on a war footing if you actually are in a full scale war. So he used the word, but he didn't actually, which I think is significant in itself. But he hasn't made a declaration of war. Let's put it that way. I think Pepe Escobar is right that they may redefine it as a counter-terrorist operation. And I'm not even quite sure what the differences would be. They just may show less restraint on going after high-ranking officials, that kind of thing. If they're terrorists, that they mean. I don't know. I really, I guess we'll have to see, what it actually means. If it's just purely a kind of a change of labels, or there will be some sort of effect on the way that operations are actually conducted. I suspect there are, but I just don't know. I don't know what they'll be. I'll be honest with you.
Well, it's also just an open statement that we're not negotiating anymore, that this isn't going to end in negotiations. You can't negotiate with a terrorist regime. The terrorist regime has to be destroyed, overthrown. So that's what this is saying then to Zelensky and his people. You guys cannot stay in power.
Right. Yeah, I think that's probably correct, yes.
Do you believe that's an apt characterization of the Kiev regime right now, to say that it is a terrorist regime?
I actually do. I don't think that's an exaggeration. Again, some attacks are described as being terrorist in nature by the Russians, and I'll disagree with them. But many of these attacks, actually attacks that occur virtually every day, multiple times a day, are clearly, terrorist. There are a lot of things. They never make it into the news in the West. And they're so frequent that even people who are looking at alternative media often don't even notice it. It's just part of the background noise. But just every day, there are obvious attacks, intentional attacks on civilian targets in both within, former Ukrainian territory, the Donbass, Kherson, the Zaporozhye region, all these areas that are under Russian control, and also in places like Belgorod and Bryansk and Kursk. They just happen every day. Again, it just can be civilian vehicles, maybe just a passenger vehicle, but even school buses and ambulances and hospitals, markets, residences. And again, sometimes these are done by HIMARS. And you could at least claim that maybe in some cases, not always, there was an attack on a marketplace a month or two ago where there was a double tap with HIMARS, I believe it was. So, obviously it was intentional. But most of these are carried out by FPV drones. So in other words, they're done intentionally because they're looking at what they're hitting. They know what they're hitting. So this is terrorism that goes on every day in and day out. It's been going on for a long time. It actually began long before the launch of the SMO. And so, yeah, I would say, I don't think that's an unfair characterization. It's not just, a propaganda move. I think it's actually, maybe you could say, a very late recognition of a reality. Just remember, like, the agony of Donetsk City, that it was shelled, virtually every day for 11, 12 years. And it's only now that, because of the Russian advances that has ended. And that was, all these shells, went into entirely civilian areas. And they knew that. So what is that if it's not terrorism? It's terrorism, plain and simple.
So you're saying it's been a terrorist regime from the outset then?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, I think that's really true. Clearly, maybe you could argue at the beginning that it was rogue elements. But I just don't think you can make that argument now. It's just so frequent and it's widespread. It's not just one unit in one place or anything. It's up and down the line, and it happens all the time.
Does it seem to be that these terrorist operations are being done in conjunction with Western intelligence, that Western intelligence is providing them with the ability to carry out many of these terrorist activities?
Well, I think in the case of the FPV drones, you could say indirectly because they rely on the Starlink, but it doesn't mean that the West is actually involved in the individual decisions to target these things. They just provide the system. They give them the capability to do it, but it is the Ukrainians that are making these decisions, and that's true also of like artillery shelling. When you just fire a shell into the middle of a city, nowhere near to any military installation, that's a decision made by I don't know where the decision's made, but that can be entirely Ukrainian. They're not dependent on targeting data or anything. Now with a HIMARS, there was a report, I think, maybe two, may even be something like 3 years ago, around the time that these HIMARS strikes were, in every case, were involved the Americans. That they actually approved individual strikes. So I haven't seen that again. It's been a long time. I don't know if that's still true, but that certainly was reported at one stage in the war. So that in the case of a HIMARS strike, there may very well be Western involvement and approval. Again, I would say that that's not true of FPV and artillery strikes, which make up the great majority of these attacks on civilians.
Do the Russians believe that they are at war with the West at large right now, that this has already gotten to the point where they are framing it in that sense, or at least at war with the intelligence agencies?
Yeah, I think it's a very common perception among Russians, from what I understand.
It's an accurate perception,
yeah.
Right?
And, there have been statements by a lot of Russian officials, like Putin hasn't gone quite out and said that, but to my knowledge. But yeah, I think that's well understood, and it's reflected in a lot of statements by officials, and it's just that's the perception among Russians themselves. And it's clear, again, it's actually been reported in Western media that we are very deeply involved in all these strikes. Well, not all these strikes, but in the war in general, very, very, where it just at every level, every facet of the Ukrainian military is supported by and is often directed by the West.
And it makes it sound like it's going to be hard to avoid some type of direct confrontation with Russia and the West. I mean, how does Russia have to remove these intelligence agencies? Do they feel... I mean, think about... It seems clear that Britain is getting very deeply involved into this conflict. They were the masterminds behind the Kursk invasion, along with Zelensky, it seems like. And then it sounds like they were heavily involved in this Operation Spiderweb. At least that's what a lot of people are saying. And there's this whole thing, Project Alchemy, that I heard Max Blumenthal talking about, just this long history of all these attacks, this deep intelligence program to destabilize and destroy Russia coming out of MI6.
Yeah. Right. I hear those reports too, and I don't, I can't confirm them. We can't, but I think there's little question that they have been very much involved in it. In fact, have taken the lead in certain operations. I think one in particular, this again came out in Western media, was that the Krinky disaster, the establishment of that miserable beachhead on the left bank of the Dnieper, close to Kherson City. That was conceived by the British, and it was the total disaster. Yeah, they sacrificed a lot of Ukrainian lives and achieved nothing. But yeah, they're always cooking up these things. It just seems like it's those, they kind of the British Empire, hasn't entirely died within their arms, within their minds, I should say, rather. They're still trying to kind of live it out. It's the ghost of the British Empire. Um, that maybe animates these really nutty and often very self-destructive operations.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised. I always had I guess, more positive view of the Brits.
Yeah,
seemed
there are many
to be
things.
more dignified and civilized and posh. It's the accent. It threw me off.
Yeah, no. I certainly, I admire, especially just the older generations of the Brits. I think there's much to be admired about them. The stiff upper lip and their magnificent literary achievements. All that is something that, but. Yeah, this Britain is, well, there's always been a dark side. I think that's probably true of any country. There's always been a dark side to empire um, and yeah, the new Britain seems to have, it seems to have abandoned everything, but it's kind of maybe its worst instincts. That's, the things that made it great are gone, but then the dark side remains and grows.
So what is Russia going to do? Are they going to do something punitive towards the UK? Or are they just going to, I imagine they're going to confine everything, their targets within Ukraine. But it's just becoming increasingly more obvious to Russia and to the world that, hey, this is being directed by MI6, CIA, NATO. This is the problem.
Yeah,
but we don't want war with them. So
what
do we do?
Yeah, well, that's the very narrow path that the Kremlin has to tread. I mean, that's the thing. You don't want to encourage further attacks, but at the same time, you don't want World War III. And I think that if they're going to err, they're probably going to err on the side of caution. That's what we've seen so far. It's just like, okay, maybe it feels good, but whatever we do, there are going to be more of these attacks. These attacks are embarrassing, but they do not affect the course of the war. They haven't done any significant damage to our war-making capabilities, and we don't predict that they will. There will be future embarrassments, but we are winning this war. We will win the war. In the end, we will achieve our objectives. And what we don't want to do is to make this into a wider war. We don't want to have an all-out open, NATO versus Russia war. That would not be good for anybody. Maybe they're confident that they could win it, but it would be highly destructive, and it would always entail the possibility of escalation to a nuclear conflict, and they just don't want to go there. So yeah, okay, we took this. This was an embarrassment. The Zelensky and his people can thump their chests and celebrate and exaggerate their minor achievement, and it'll be celebrated in the West. And this is infuriating, but ultimately it's meaningless. What matters is what's happening on the front, and that's everything there is going in our favor. And we predict, maybe because we have this new offensive plan, that's just going to accelerate. It's going to accelerate tremendously this year. So why, we have a winning plan. We're going to win. We're going to achieve our objectives within a year or two. Why get waylaid? Why allow ourselves to be provoked and do something that could, spark a larger conflict that again would just be dangerous for the whole region and for the world.
Right. I know that Russia is going to win, but I don't know if it's going to be like we said, it's going to be an ugly victory. Even if they take Kiev, they're going to be left with this rump terrorist state that is going to be continually probably funded and supported with Western intelligence. MI6 and CIA will still pump in this. So you're going to just have terrorist activity coming out of this Lvov for the next indefinite future, right? I mean, I just don't see it. It seems like the only way maybe to end it is Western hegemony has to end. There has to stop. Support has to be cut off to these to the Banderites to this neo-Nazi fascist element that's in West Ukraine. That's what needs to be crushed. Putin doesn't want to go all the way to Poland to the border. You know, so I don't see this ending. I just see that maybe you can get depose Zelensky. They end up taking Kiev. They end up taking 8 oblasts, 10 oblasts. But they're going to have, at some point, they're going to enter Banderite territory. And then they're going to have to stop or deal with insurgency problems. And then if they do stop, they're going to have to deal with terrorist attacks coming across that border constantly. I don't see a good way to end it unless Western hegemony falls into this. The problem is the intelligence agencies, the institutions. That's what we need to go to war with. And I hope that, Trump was supposed to go to war with the intelligence agencies. Seems like he hasn't been able to do diddly squat there, though. And he's just been absorbed by it. But I mean, like, I feel like the populations of Western Europe and the United States, we also want to get rid of the intelligence agencies. We can work together on this. This is a popular thing. It feels like the intelligence agencies are a rogue element. They have way too much power, way too much control. It's really shady. Nobody likes it. And yeah,
I don't have it. I really don't have an answer for that. I mean, that just seems like an insoluble problem. Certainly in the near term, I just don't see a solution. Most people expect that the Russians will stop when they short of Banderite territory. So they'll take the east and the south. And by taking the south, they deprive what remains of Ukraine of access to the Black Sea. And that actually is a big help right there, because their access to the Black Sea has allowed them to do things like this attack on the Kerch Bridge recently. They've been launching their sea drones from places like Odessa. But if the Russians take Nikolaev and Odessa and go all the way to Transnistria, they will deprive them of that access, and that will make the Black Sea safer for them. But it doesn't prevent other terrorist attacks, because of course it's going to be a perennial problem, because there are so many Ukrainians in Russia. The vast majority are very friendly, but it's just easy for a Ukrainian to travel to Russia and not really attract a whole lot of attention, because that's part of life there. And Russia, again, as I said last time, in spite of what we hear in the West, it's not anything like a totalitarian society. It's a free society. It's a very vast territory, and even if the intelligence agencies are always at the top of their game, I just don't think they can. There's just no way that it can prevent, future attacks similar to the one that we've seen. I don't have an answer. One thing, though, that I found very interesting was just recently there was Poland got a new president, and this person is very, very strongly anti-Banderite, as many Poles are, for very good reason, because they remember what happened during World War II. They remember these massacres. I think it was well over 100,000 Poles were massacred, by Stefan Bandera and his people. So they actually have chosen a day to commemorate the genocide, as they put it, of the Poles by the OUN, which is, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, headed by Stepan Bandera. That's made the Ukrainian government very upset. But it's funny, it's not that the Poles are anywhere like being on the side of the Russians. They're still supporting the Ukrainians, and probably certainly will continue to support the Ukrainians in the foreseeable future. But the Russians and the Poles now agree on that one aspect of the problem. They say, yeah, we got to get rid of the Banderites, the so-called denazification. and they also are firmly against NATO membership for Ukraine. So there's the two very, very important points, that again, that Putin made clear at the start of the SMO, and the Poles are in agreement with that. I don't know if that's something that we can build on in the future, but there's something there. So yeah, we need, for this to really solve this problem, there has to be, let's say, a change of direction, a change of policy in the West, in places like Poland. And but if they continue to support, all of Ukraine's worst tendencies, which they've done, and they simply look the other way. Every time there's a terrorist attack, they look the other way. Every time there's a celebration of Stepan Bandera, they look the other way. But if that can change, then maybe there's some hope for a solution for Ukraine. But as things are, they're just so obsessed with hating Russia that they're supporting all of Ukraine's worst tendencies. And I think, even if it's a greatly weakened rump state, it'll be an anti-Russia. I think, as Lavrov and others have put it, it's sort of a state whose main purpose, that sees its main role on the world stage as attacking Russia, and it'll be there, and it'll have support from the West, and it's going to continue to be just like a festering sore on the body of Russia. Maybe they can control it, but it's just I think you're right. There will continue to be these kind of attacks unless something fundamentally changes on the other side. And I just don't know how you can bring it about. Now, some people, for example, Mark Sloboda is one of them, says that, he knows that the Russians don't want to march all the way to the Polish border, but he believes that they're just going to have to. That's what it's going to, and maybe he's right. It just may be that they realize they have to do it, and it'll be a very bloody and a very unpleasant affair. But maybe they just have to just kind of take this, uproot this, this ideology, really truly uproot it. Just take it out root and branch, and the only way you can do that is through actually occupying the territory. But it's more than an occupation. It would have to be a very repressive military occupation. I don't know if the Russians really have a stomach for that.
Yeah, I feel like what needs to be done is the intelligence agencies need to be destroyed, scattered to the winds. But I don't know how possible that will be. It felt like we were making some progress in dismantling the deep state. When Trump first came to power, we had, USAID was a big bombshell, and we were involved in all these regime change operations through these NGOs and all this. But then, and we had all this talk about the Epstein files, and then all of a sudden everyone's like, he killed himself. Nobody looked into this. And now we have this bombshell from Elon saying that Trump is compromised by Epstein. And that's why, he's doing what he's doing. And it makes sense to me. People know that Epstein and Trump knew each other. Trump's been to Epstein's island. I kind of always suspected this. But it seems like, it's just crazy that our whole governments are just compromised. These are all compromised individuals. And because they're compromised and they have done terrible, horrible things, that they're going to be able to lead us into war. And then it makes me wonder, if it's the Epstein thing, we know Epstein's ties to Israel, his father being a Mossad agent, or Ghislaine Maxwell being Israeli, and
her father being
high up in Mossad. And it seems to be clear that there's a very, very strong Israel connection here. And it brings me to this question is, does Israel want the war in Ukraine to continue? I know there are a lot of Ukrainians and Russians that live in Israel. What's their position on it? Well,
I think, first of all, it's secondary to them. I don't think that they have any particular desire to support that war. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just looking, they could see it as at least a potential diversion of resources. Now, it's so far, when push comes to shove, it looks like Israel gets what it wants. Recently there was a story, in fact, that certain components were removed from I believe, air
Interceptors,
defense
right?
interceptors, right, and sent to
Right.
Israel. So they actually, reduce the capabilities of these interceptors within Ukraine, just to again to beef up. I don't know if it's actually Israel, but at least for the Middle East. But if it wasn't Israel itself, it's for the defense of Israel. Probably in anticipation of a conflict with Iran. So this is what we see again and again. I think it's just when push comes to shove, Israel gets what it wants. There may be a few exceptions. Um, I think a certain number of artillery shells were actually diverted from Israel. They had been stockpiled there and sent to, at least there were reports of that sent maybe a year ago or so. Who knows what actually happened. They were diverted to Ukraine. There were some, I think, a Patriot system or two, or a few Patriot systems. But again, the Israelis had mothballed them and said that they really weren't very helpful. And those were diverted to Ukraine. So, maybe by and large, they actually just see it as competition, you know, competition over resources and attention from the United States, and they would prefer not to have it. Or maybe they feel like they can manage it. And perhaps again, on a information war level, it just maybe say, okay, well, it also diverts attention from what's going on in Gaza. But I don't see a real clear-cut case. Perhaps I'm missing something, but I don't see how it would be clearly in their favor, to enlarge or to continue the war in Ukraine. I think it's something where, okay, if it's going on, they can manage it, and they'll use it to the extent they can to again strengthen ties with their supporters or their allies. But if it ends, it ends. I don't think it really fundamentally alters their calculations, and they might even be happy if it ends. Again, I may be missing something, but I just don't see how it's a big boost to their, how the war is actually helping their own military efforts within the Middle East.
Do you believe Trump is compromised, and if so, how so? Like, what did is it Epstein videos? Is that what you think? I mean,
it could be. It could. It's certainly possible. Again, we've talked about it. I think there's no question that there was a Mossad connection to Epstein, and it's a practice again that intelligence agencies around the world have used. They get compromising materials, and this was just sort of the ideal. The ideal, operation, to achieve those. If you want to collect compromising materials, you buy an island and stock it with underage, girls, and you get powerful people from the Western establishment to visit it, and you have cameras in every room, and wow, you just have this treasure trove of compromising material. And we've wondered often, why it is that the leadership in the West has been so complicit, why nobody ever speaks out. And a lot of it is just pure ideology. But again, it may in some cases be this. It just may be, outright blackmail. And it could extend to Trump. It's possible. I don't know. It's just Trump may very well be in the file. Now, Elon Musk is not 100% reliable. He's made claims in the past that proved to be false. Sometimes he spread false information, but it's certainly believable.
Right. I find it believable. Obviously, we're just speculating here, but do you think that it explains some of Trump's behavior, vis-a-vis Iran and just the Middle East in general?
It could. It's not necessary. I mean, he has always put himself forward as a zealous supporter of Zionism. He does have this Jewish son-in-law, and he's got all these connections in New York. He's socially tied to Zionism. Let's put it that way. So even absent some compromising materials, it's just not surprising. But that would just add to it. If he had second thoughts, and I believe that he's probably had second thoughts about his support for Zionists. I think that's probably true of Trump. But if he's had second thoughts, then he'll remember, oh, damn, they got that video, okay, let's stop thinking about that. We just won't go down that path. That's possible.
It's so wild. It just feels like the every single politician in America seems to be compromised, other than Thomas Massey. He seems to be the only one. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's not
Maybe they're
necessarily that. They didn't all go to that island, but often it's just outright money. It's just sort of
right
outright
money,
bribes.
APAC,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, I think it's becoming more and more apparent to the everyday citizen that our politicians are compromised the longer this Gaza conflict goes on, because when we see so many children that are dying, starvation, just clear attacks on clear ethnic cleansing, clearly what's looking to be very genocidal
right,
to so many
right, and
people.
and backed up
Like,
by really explicit statements by Israeli leadership. It's not like, oh, people are interpreting these images in a certain way or whatever, but the Israeli leadership is openly talking about, and they have from the beginning. It seems like especially at the immediately following October 7th, they refer to the human animals, no innocence, and this came from people across the spectrum. Like Galant was
right.
one of them. I think he referred to the Palestinians as human animals. He was the defense minister at the time, if I remember correctly. Yeah, but then we were getting just the, the same kind of statements with increasing frequency from let's say the heights uh, of Israeli politics and culture, and then we had those poll results. We're just talking about it's not just a few bad leaders, or it's just a few individuals at the top, but it's just the entire society is in favor of ethnic cleansing, is in favor of really genocide in one form or another.
Right. You can hear it straight from their mouths themselves. Like I said, 82% of Israelis support ethnic
Yeah,
cleansing of all of Gaza. So it you can't sugarcoat it anymore. So when anybody is trying to sugarcoat it and trying to cover for it and justify what's happening in Gaza, then immediately people are like, you have to be compromised, because no normal person would come to this conclusion if you're watching what's unfolding for so long. And it's been 20 months now of this, of just nonstop children dying. How many people have we seen burned alive? Children, little girls being burned alive, things like this, and you're still saying, "Oh, Israel has the right to defend itself." To me, it's becoming clear that these people are compromised in some way,
yeah,
and I think the most of the world is seeing that. And I'm just wondering, the majority of the world is just disgusted at what Israel is doing, and I'm just wondering how the rest of the world is viewing this relationship between Israel and the United States. Everybody knew that there was kind of something there,
mm,
but I don't think people realized to the extent,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. Right. Well, there was always an awareness, but this has shined a very bright light on that relationship. And I would say, as far as the fact that there are still many people that are supporting the Israeli government, even the Netanyahu government. For example, just basically the Republican Party of the United States. Um, I don't think you have to go to actually, the let's say the Epstein explanation of events, or even the APAC uh, bribe explanation of events. There is this ideological fervor that we talked about, this identity, which that people can just hang on to very tightly in spite of evidence, shelter themselves. They close their eyes, they plug their ears, and they shout, the usual slogans. It's this is not the first time in history where we've seen things like that happen. Again, it's just that support for Israel was not shallow. It isn't shallow within the U.S. So it's yeah, I think that's true, that part of what's going on is blackmail, is bribes, but it's not all of it. I think it's actually still most of it is that ideological commitment, this identification with Israel that many people have adopted. And then it's just something like when it's questioned, it feels like their very selves, their very sense of what's right and good is being questioned. And people will fight that for a long time. Now it's, eventually it breaks down. I read an interesting article in Haaretz about actually an Israeli Jew, and describing how, like, he'd heard these things and he just he refused to consider the Gazans as people. He just, he saw some images, he heard these stories, but it's just like every time he'd go back and think to October 7th, and that would just like cause him um, once again strengthen his resolve to destroy Gaza and or at least to support the efforts, the operation that was destroying Gaza. But it finally did break through. It was just like there was some images that came, and he saw it, and he just broke down, and he had to say, "Oh gosh, these are humans. What are we doing?" So it can happen, but you could see how he wasn't compromised. We're talking about an Israeli individual, so you can the emotional ties. The emotional investment for them is much greater, you would think, than for Americans. So it's something even harder for him to do. Now, clearly, he's an outlier, but he did do it, But I was struck by how difficult it was and how long he fought it, and then finally it did break through. So that's what we can hope for. I think again among like American supporters of Israel, that's I think where like the main battle is being fought, and the opponents of Zionism are winning. They're not winning fast enough, but they are winning.
Well, we haven't had a poll that I've seen in the past month or two, but there's a poll that came out 2 or 3 months ago that showed that the majority of Americans, 53%, had an unfavorable view of Israel. I imagine that number is higher now.
I would expect so. Yeah.
Right, but what we're seeing within the political elite, it's 98%. That are in lockstep with Israel. So that's the problem. It's just that we have this disconnect once again. I know there is this deep-rooted ideological grip of Zionism here in the United States, but the grip is concentrated in our elite. Yeah. And it just... I don't know is that the biggest problem that we have? I mean, it's clear that we're not in control, that this is, the deep state is real. Israeli control over American politicians is real. What do we do? People are waking up to it. How does this play out? Can we get Thomas Massie elected? What can happen? Will we see more and more people? We're seeing more and more people turn, like Piers Morgan has turned on Israel, and they're coming after him hard, which I think is going to strengthen his resolve against like, hey, this is not okay, and who knows, maybe Elon Musk will come out and say something now with these Epstein files. But once it becomes so clear to everybody what's happened, what is going on, that the United States is being controlled in large part by a foreign country, what does that do to us? What does that do to the world? Mm-hmm. How do we handle that problem?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting state of affairs. Again, there is actually, again, not unusual within the West. Again, there is this great disconnect between the elite, the establishment, and the people. You're finding it, here 53% have an unfavorable view. In places like Britain, which is also very, very strongly, the government is very, very pro-Zionist. It's 60%. And then in other European countries, it can be 70% or more. Yet these governments, with just the exceptions of, let's say, Spain and Ireland, which have taken some steps against Israel, they haven't, I think they're actually really still could characterize those as rather timid and, as timid half measures, but something. The others are fully on board, and, in spite of some recent statements by Merz and Macron and Starmer himself, they have done nothing to lessen their support for Israel. So we have this huge gap again between the elite and the people. How is that going to end? And I think I've said in the past, I see two main roads that we could go down. Again, history always surprises us. There's probably a third road that we never thought of. But the two main ones that I see are that, we do have some sort of revolution. A firm anti-Zionist is elected to office. Most likely it would happen in Europe first. Unfortunately, you just don't see that because, like the populists that are threatening the establishment, unfortunately, tend to have made a deal with the devil. I'm thinking of the National Rally in France, or the AfD in Germany, or even like Nigel Farage in England. Okay, these are populists who could fundamentally change the direction of their governments if they got elected to office in many areas, including, with respect to Ukraine, but not with Israel. And so it's just like something has to change. There has to be some sort of party anyway that really does change, has truly challenged the government and is willing to, to take a firm anti-Zionist position. And you see individuals, you see the people at large are asking for this, but where is it? Where are these leaders? Where are these parties? So I don't see it at present. Maybe something will happen. These parties will come forward, or these individuals will come forward. These parties will form. But now you just don't see them. So what is the alternative to, let's say, a revolution at the ballot box? And that is just increasing crackdowns. And that's actually what we've been seeing, I think, by and large. It's just that the elite understands that they have lost control over the people, and that they are at odds. And we've talked about these various incidents, or various really shenanigans that the ruling elite has carried out in places like Romania and Moldova and in France and in Germany. It's just and will they get away with it? I don't know. Maybe this will just contribute to the anger and will lead to a true alternative within these countries. That's what we can hope for. For a peaceful revolution that will break the back of support for Zionism. Now, again, it's going to take longer, I think, unfortunately, in the U.S., unless something really changes. Yeah, the U.S. is shifting too, and that's the most important layer, but they're behind Europe as far as this goes. We'll see.
Yeah, talking about becoming increasingly more authoritarian, have you heard much about this Palantir program?
I've heard some about it. I haven't. It's a kind of a data collection and management program. Is that right? It would. I guess again, my understanding is limited. You probably can explain it better than I can, but it would just empower the state to surveil its citizenry, and it has a clear, I think, Israeli connection.
Right. Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive on it, but it does sound worrying. I know Max Blumenthal has done, and I need to read his article on Gray Zone about it. But it seems like, there's this thing, Foundry, that has a database, basically everybody. And it's something that's closely tied with Israel. Israel uses Palantir in its Lavender AI genocide program, so it's sketchy, but it just feels like, why would Trump make a move like this? And then you hear about, we've spoken highly of JD Vance before, but Peter Thiel was a co-founder, I guess, of Palantir as well. And Peter Thiel is the one that basically handpicked and groomed JD Vance for power. And then you sort of wonder, just like, I don't know, everything is just so shady and corrupt, and a lot of the roads just lead back to Israel, and that's creepy, right?
Well, that just makes me, when you mentioned JD Vance, and I've heard about that connection to Peter Thiel. It makes me think that, like, what the West needs, or America needs, is a Vladimir Putin. When Putin came to power, Russia was under control of the oligarchs, and it was a very, very grim situation. And he just didn't really even see a solution on the horizon. It's like the oligarchs, they control everything. And, there were oligarchs that, were supported Putin in his nomination, and other oligarchs saying this is the same thing. But here was really a master politician. He knew how politics is played, and politics is always the art of the possible. I'd love to support people who go out and just speak the truth, like Thomas Massey, or Ron Paul, or any of a number of people. Right now there's certainly people.
That's it. There's only two.
No. Well,
there's not many.
Yeah, there are not many. Yeah, I was thinking again. It's really true. You would think that there would be people on the left. There are certainly leftist intellectuals who speak the truth, and we often mention them, but you just don't find them in the Congress right now, the representatives there. Um, but that's not usually how things move forward. Let's be honest. It's good that there's people there, they're speaking, and other people are listening. It's somebody who has to be craftier and really knows how to fight to win a war in this dirty game of politics. And that's one thing. It's like when Putin came to power, it wasn't just a simple, he didn't just turn on all the oligarchs at once. He used oligarchs against oligarchs and gradually, drove them out, and then finally neutralized those that were remaining. But it took, he had to be very, very crafty, and he didn't have to. He had to be very careful. He couldn't advertise his intentions. He had to ally himself with some very unpleasant characters in the short run to achieve victories. And then once he actually was able to gain power, he was then able to turn on some of these people that he worked with. That's what you'd have to do. So I could at least imagine, I could hope that J.D. Vance could be a person like this, because he is a very smart man, I think, and somebody with a real intellectual substance, unlike Trump. That's the unfortunate thing. Trump, again, we've talked about him so much, I don't need to talk about him anymore. But Vance, potentially, who knows? Maybe he really is a true believer in Israel, or, he is corrupt. I don't know enough about him. But maybe if you don't get a revolution from below, maybe you have somebody like in the establishment that understands what needs to be done, and has the ability, has the political skills to actually carry out a revolution from the top. We can just speculate, but that's because right now you just don't see anybody. That's.
Yeah, it's such a shame. Everybody put so much hope in Trump because he was marketing himself as an anti-establishment person, but he's just so wishy-washy and just politically weak.
Yeah.
He just seems to succumb to pressure, or like you're saying, he might just be completely compromised. I mean, or all of the above.
Yeah. Well,
not intellectually sound, compromised.
Yeah, the problem is he doesn't really have a command of the facts. He's intellectually lazy. We've heard from different sources that he doesn't even listen to these intelligence reports. He sits down and watches the news and talks to his friends and whatever. And sometimes he picks up good ideas, but then others, and he just doesn't. He just doesn't seem to have the intellectual discipline to actually, to adopt, one set of ideas and then work out a strategy to support it. He's just, as we know, he's just all over the map. So he's just, in the end, he's up against a very disciplined establishment that knows what it wants, and they're going to win a battle against somebody like that. I mean, he got in a few punches at the beginning, but he's like a boxer that just kind of just punches wildly in every direction, and the disciplined boxer will take him down eventually. I don't know if that analogy worked, but maybe.
Yeah, it worked. Yeah. I feel like things have been have fundamentally changed. I've lost faith in being able to extract ourselves from the conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine. And it just feels like the inevitable path then is that we're back on this escalation path that will ultimately lead to the collapse of the Western hegemony, which needs to happen. Hopefully it'll happen peacefully, or a nuclear war, or full out. Yeah, it just the question, I guess, becomes, how does that collapse? Do we end up going through an all-out war, potentially even a nuclear war? Do we go through a financial collapse that brings it down, or do we have some type of revolution within these countries? Those seem to be the three paths, and things will continually get more and more terrifying as we get closer and closer, as things get more and more tense between Israel and Iran, or what's happening in Gaza. It gets worse and worse. With Ukraine, if Russia begins to start marching onto Kiev closer and closer, this is where that's where I think, the rubber meets the road. Is, okay, are we going to war? Are we going to be pumping in so much money that we just experienced a financial collapse? or are we going to see people take to the streets in all these countries and overthrow governments? Do you think so?
Well,
Those
yeah, I
are
think you're
what
right.
we're
And
looking
I'm,
at.
I really don't want to put my money on anything. It's just the only thing that I'm certain of is that it's going to get crazier, and that we're going to, and that the escalation will continue. Who knows where it'll end?
Yeah, and I feel like we might be seeing, one of these things happen potentially this year. That's
Yeah,
scary. It's so crazy that
yeah,
I don't know if do you think most of the people are aware of what's happening, of what's going on, or is it going to hit people like just blindside them when all of a sudden like, oh my goodness, we're in war, and, nukes are flying, or all of a sudden like, oh what, someone's overthrowing the government right now, or we have the dollar's worthless, it's
yeah.
like
I think most people are blissfully ignorant. Let's be honest. It's just the vast majority of people are leading their lives. I think, like in polls show this, that there is this growing sense of unease, a growing sense of pessimism. They know that something's wrong, but very few people, have a real, let's say, granular or detailed understanding of what's taking place, what the issues are, where the real dangers are. It's just sort of they, that they find it harder and harder to make ends meet, and they've stopped believing in mainstream news sources. Some of them have found good alternatives. Others have found, frankly, nutty alternatives. It's just, who knows? I think that, uh, yeah, it would be interesting to see. Maybe people wouldn't be that there is this growing pessimism. I don't think most people understand exactly where the threats are, but if, for example, the dollar crashes, or if the war breaks out between Iran and Israel, and the U.S. is involved, and again, there will be real consequences, economic and political and military, if that happens. The if the Ukraine war escalates to the point of actually bringing in NATO troops directly, and then we have an all an open NATO versus Russia war. If anything of these happens, I think people will be surprised, yet not surprised. They just had the sense that things were wrong and things were drifting in the wrong direction. And there will be anger, and we'll see, hopefully that anger will be directed in constructive directions. But
okay, but you agree one of those things is going to happen: financial collapse,
yeah,
war, revolution.
it seems like the one that's inevitable, like the Ukraine escalation could be avoided. And again, it just might very well be because when push comes to shove and Macron or Keir Starmer or Merz says, send in the troops, their militaries say, we don't have them. I'm sorry, this just doesn't work. And it just, it may end right there. And also, if you do that, you're going to be impeached, or whatever the equivalent process is within those countries, because people do not support it. So it's just, I'm kind of hopeful. It is dangerous. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, but I think there's reason to be hopeful it won't happen. Now, in the Middle East, again, a war between Iran and Israel, yeah, there's a real risk of it. Again, where like the negotiations don't seem to be going anywhere, and the reports are out that there's tremendous pressure being put on Trump, to make impossible demands to the Iranians, and then to launch an attack if they don't agree to those, demands, and they won't. So, there is, in other words, tremendous pressure for war against Iran. Now, it has to be remembered that, though, in the case of Iran and Israel, this is an old story. There have been real major efforts on the part of Israel to push the U.S. into war, and you have previous presidents going back to George W. Bush and Obama complaining about it. It's like the damn Israelis are trying to make me, attack Iran, and they have pushed back. It hasn't happened. So maybe, I think that maybe the pressure is greater now than ever, and we have a really desperate Netanyahu in Israel. So perhaps, this is the time it might happen, but we might avert it again. That won't, unfortunately, save the Gazans, but we could avoid that war. I think the one that's inevitable is the financial collapse, because we're just so clearly on an unsustainable course. And it's just the timing of that, it's not clear. Is it going to happen under Trump? It could very well happen under Trump. Again, we're partly because of his own economic policies. He's not responsible for these trends, but he's helped to accelerate them. And again, the debt is becoming something. We've gone on about this before, but that's the one that seems to me that cannot be avoided. I just don't see it. I know certain financial analysts said that if we instituted very wise policies right now, we could avoid it. But I think the chance of that is virtually zero. And so we are going to go off the cliff there. It's just a question of when.
Crazy. Yeah. And with Iran, if Trump is truly compromised with the Epstein files, that could, who knows, but that pushes into a war. So many different little things at play. Okay. Well, scary times ahead. We'll have a lot to talk about at least. So you are going to be, if anybody wants to listen to some more of my dad, you're going to be on Garland Nixon's show today at what time?
4 p.m.
At 4 p.m. Eastern time. So, please check that out if you want to hear some more. Also, my dad and I will be doing a members only video tomorrow. So if you're interested in becoming a member, go ahead and click join down below. Okay, Dad. Have a good rest of your day. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your talk with Garland, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.